Hello and welcome to Lesson 3.2 in our course Educational Psychology. Now, as the name or as the title of this lesson suggests, this is the second part of our lesson in student development. In the first lesson, we've talked about why this development matters. We've also looked into physical and cognitive development. So, for this video, we are going to talk about social and moral development. So, social development refers to the long-term changes in relationships and interaction involving self, peer, and family. It includes both positive changes such as how friendships develop and negative changes such as aggression or bullying. Now, the social developments that are the most obviously related to the classroom life falls into three main categories. First is that changes in self-concept and in relationships among student and teachers. Second is changes in basic needs or personal motives. And third is changes in sense of right and responsibilities. So as with cognitive development, each of these areas has a broad, well-known theory and theorists for that matter that provides a framework for thinking about how the areas relate to teaching. So for development of self-concept and relationship, it is the theory of Erikson. For development of personal motives, it is the theory of Abraham Maslow. And for development of ethical knowledge and belief, it is the works of Lawrence Kohlberg and his critic and student or former student, Gilligan. Now, these theories are definitely not the only ones related to social development of students. And their ideas are often debated by other researchers, but their account do explain much about social development that is relevant to teaching and education. So, like Piaget, Erikson developed a theory of social development that relies on stages, except that Erikson thought of stages as a series of psychological or social or psychosocial crisis. So, turning points in a person's relationship and feelings about himself or herself. So, each crisis consists of a dilemma or choice that carries both advantages and risks. So both in which one choice or alternative is normally considered more desirable or healthy. So how one crisis is resolved affect how later crises are resolved too. So the resolution also helps to create an individual's developing personality. Erikson proposed 8 crises that extend from birth through old age. They are summarized in this figure here. So, 4 of the stages occur during the school years. So, we will give these special attentions here. But it is also helpful to know what crises are throughout one's lifespan, both before and after those in school years. So let's first talk about the crisis of infants and preschoolers, which are trust, autonomy, and initiative. So almost from the day they are born, infants face a crisis, or at least in Erikson's sense, about trust and mistrust. They are happiest if they can eat, sleep, and excrete according to their own physiological schedules, regardless of whether their schedules are convenient for the caregiver or for the caregiver. Often this is the child's mother. Unfortunately, though, a young infant is in no position to control or influence a mother's caregiving or scheduling needs. So the baby faces a dilemma about how much to trust or mistrust the mother's helpfulness. It is as if the baby asks, if I demand food or sleep or a clean diaper now, will my mother actually be able to help me meet this need. Now, hopefully, between the two of them, mother and child, resolve this choice in favor of the baby's trust. The mother proves herself at least good enough in her attentiveness, and the baby risks trusting mother's motivation and skills at caregiving. Almost as soon as the crisis is resolved, however, a new one develops over the issue of autonomy and shame. Now, the child who is now a toddler may now trust his or her caregiver, which is most likely the mother, but the very trust contributes to a desire to assert autonomy by taking care of basic personal needs, such as feeding, toileting, or dressing oneself. Given the child's lack of experience in these areas, however, self-care is risky at first. The toddler may feed or toilet or dress clumsily and ineffectively. The child's caregiver, for her part, risks overprotecting the child and criticizing his early efforts unnecessarily, and thus causing the child to feel shame for even trying. Hopefully, as with the early crisis of trust, the new crisis gets resolved in favor of autonomy through the combined efforts of the child to exercise autonomy and of the caregiver to support the child's efforts. So, eventually, about the time a child is of preschool age, the autonomy exercised during the previous period becomes more elaborate, extended, and focused on objects and people other than the child and basic physical needs. Now, the child at a daycare center may now undertake, for example, to build the biggest city in the world out of available Lego units, even if other children want some of their blocks for themselves. Now, the child's project and desires create a new crisis of initiative and guilt, because the child soon realizes that acting on impulses or desires can sometimes have negative effects on others. More Lego for the child may mean fewer for someone else. So, as with the crisis over autonomy, caregivers have to support the child's initiative when possible, but also not to make the child feel guilty just for desiring to have or to do something that affects other people's welfare. By limiting behavior when necessary but not limiting internal feelings, the child can develop a lasting ability to take initiative. Expressed in Erikson terms, the crisis is then resolved in favor of initiative. So, even though only the last of these three crises overlaps with school years, all three relate to issues faced by students of any age, and even by their teachers. A child or youth who is fundamentally mistrustful, for example, has a serious problem in coping with school life. If you are a student, it is essential for your long-term survival to believe that teachers and school officials have your best interest at heart, and that they are not imposing assignments or making rules, for example, just for the heck of it. Even though students are not infants anymore, teachers function like Erikson's caregiving parents, in that they need to prove worthy of students' trust through their initial flexibility and attentiveness. Parallels from the classroom also exist for the crisis of autonomy and initiative. To learn effectively, students need to make choices and understand, and rather undertake academic initiatives at least some of the time, even though not every choice or initiative may be practical or even desirable. So teachers, for their part, need to make true choices for an initiative possible. And refrain from criticizing, even accidentally, a choice or intention behind an initiative, even if the teacher privately believes that it is bound to fail. Support for choice and initiative should be focused on providing resources and on guiding the student's effort towards more likely success. In these ways, teachers function like parents of toddlers and preschoolers in Erikson's theory of development, regardless of the age of their students. So now we move on to the crisis of childhood. Once into elementary school, the child is faced for the first time with becoming competent and worthy in the eyes of the world at large, or more precisely in the eyes of classmates and teachers. To achieve their esteem, he or she must develop skills that require effort that is sustained and somewhat focused. So, the challenge creates the crisis of industry and inferiority. To be respected by teachers, for example, the child must learn to read and to behave like a true student. To be respected by peers, he or she must learn to cooperate and to be friendly, among other things. There are risks involved in working on these skills and qualities, because there can be no guarantee of success with them in advance. If the child does not does succeed, therefore he or she experiences the satisfaction of a job well done and of a skill well learned, a feeling that Erikson called industry. If not, however, the child risks feeling lasting inferiority compared to others. Teachers, therefore, have a direct, explicit role in helping students to resolve this crisis in favor of industry or success. They can set realistic academic goals for students, ones that tend to lead to success, and then provide materials and assistance for students to reach their goals. Teachers can also express their confidence that students can in fact meet their goals if and when the students get discouraged, and avoid hinting, even accidentally, that a student is simply a loser or stupid or not good enough. Paradoxically, these strategies will work best if the teacher is also tolerant of less than perfect performance by students. Too much emphasis on perfection can undermine some students' confidence, foster and later on foster Erikson's inferiority by making academic goals seem beyond reach. So after the crisis of childhood of industry and inferiority is resolved, we now move on to the crisis of adolescence. As the child develops lasting talent and attitudes as a result of the crisis of industry, he begins to face a new question. What do all these talents and attitudes add up to be? Who is the me embedded in this profile of qualities? These questions are the crisis of identity and role confusion. Defining identity is riskier than it may appear for a person simply because some talents and attitudes may be poorly developed and some even may be undesirable in the eyes of others. If you are poor at math, how do you live with family and friends if they think you should be good at this skill? Still, others may be valuable but fail to be noticed by other people. The result is that who a person wants to be may not be the same as who or she is in actual life, nor the same as who other people want the person to be. In Erikson terms, role confusion is the result. Teachers can minimize role confusion in a number of ways. One is to offer students lots of diverse role models by identifying models in school, in students' reading materials, for example, or by inviting diverse guests at school. The point of these strategies would be to express a key idea that there are many ways to be respected, successful, and satisfied with life. Another way to support students' identity development is to be alert to students' confusion about their futures and refer them to counselors or other mental health professionals outside the school that can help sort these out. Still, another strategy is to tolerate change in students' goals and priorities. Sudden change in extracurricular activities or in personal plan after graduation. Since students are still trying roles out, discouraging experimentation may not be in the student's best interest. After this is resolved, we now move on to the crisis of adulthood, that is intimacy, generativity, and integrity. Now, beyond the school years, according to Erikson, individuals continue psychosocial development by facing additional crises. Young adults, for example, face a crisis of intimacy and isolation. This crisis is about the risk of establishing close relationships with a selected number of others. Whether the relationships are heterosexual, homosexual, or not sexual at all, their defining qualities are depth and sustainability. Without them, an individual risks feeling isolated. Assuming that a person resolves this crisis in favor of intimacy, however, he or she then faces a crisis about generativity and stagnation. This crisis is characteristic of most of adulthood, and not surprisingly, therefore, is about caring for or making a contribution to society, and especially to its younger generation. Generativity is about making life productive and creative so that it matters to others. One obvious way for some to achieve this feeling is by raising children. But there are also many other ways to contribute to the welfare of others. The final crisis is about integrity and despair, and it is characteristically felt during the final years of life. At the end of life, a person is likely to review the past and to ask whether it has been a life well lived, even if it was clearly not lived perfectly. Since personal history can no longer be altered at the end of life, it is important to make peace with whatever actually happened and to forgive oneself and others for mistakes that may have been made in the past. Now, the alternative is despair or depression from believing not only that one's life was lived badly, but also that there is no longer any hope for correcting past mistakes. Even though Erikson conceives of these crises as primarily concerned of adulthood, there are precursors of them during the school years. Intimacy, for example, is a concern of many children and youth in that they offer desire but do not always find lasting relationship with others. Personal isolation is a particular risk for students with disabilities, as well as for students whose cultural or racial backgrounds differ from classmates or the teachers. Generativity, feeling helpful to others and to the young, is needed not only by many adults but also by many children and youth. When given the opportunity as part of their school program, they frequently welcome a chance to be authentic service to others as part of their school programs. Integrity, taking responsibility for your personal past, warts and all, is often a felt need for anyone, young or old, who has lived long enough to have a past on which to look. Even children and youth have a past in this sense, though their past are of course shorter than the person who are older. So, after we've talked about the psychosocial stages of development, it is also important that we look into the hierarchy of needs. Now, Abraham Maslow's theory frames personal needs or motives as a hierarchy, meaning that basic or lower level needs have to be satisfied before higher level needs become important or motivation. Compared to the stage model of Piaget and Erikson, Maslow's hierarchy is only loosely developmental. and that Maslow was not concerned with tracking universal, irreversible changes across the lifespan. Maslow's stages are universal, but they are not irreversible. Earlier stages sometimes reappear later in life, in which case they must be satisfied again before later stages can redevelop. Like the theories of Piaget and Erikson, Maslow is a rather broad story, one that has less to say about the effects of a person's culture, language, or economic level than about what we all have in common. So, in its original version, Maslow distinguished two types of needs, called deficit needs and being needs, or sometimes deficiency needs and growth needs. In here, we will summarize the two levels and their sub-levels. Deficit needs are prior to being needs, not only in the sense of happening earlier in life, but in that deficit needs must be satisfied before being needs can be addressed. As pointed out, deficit needs can reappear at any age, depending on circumstances. If that happens, they must be satisfied again before a person's attention can shift back to higher needs. Among students, in fact, deficit needs are likely to return chronically to those whose families lack economic or social resources or who live in the stresses associated with poverty. Deficit needs are the basic requirements of physical and emotional well-being. First are physiological needs: food, sleep, clothing, and the like. Without this, nothing else matters, and especially nothing very elevated or self-fulfilling. A student who is not getting enough to eat is not going to feel much interested in learning. Once physiological needs are met, however, safety and security needs become important. The person looks for stability and protection and welcomes a bit of structure and limits if they provide their condition. A child from an abusive family, for example, may be getting enough to eat but may worry chronically about personal safety. In school, the student may appreciate a well-organized classroom with rules that ensure personal safety and predictability, whether or not the classroom provides much in this way of real learning. After physiological and safety needs are met, love and belongingness needs emerge. The person turns attention to making friends, being a friend, and cultivating positive personal relationships in general. In the classroom, a student motivated at this level may make approval from peers or teachers into a top priority. He or she may be provided for materially and find the classroom and family life safe enough, but still miss a key ingredient in life: love. If such a student, or anyone else for that matter, eventually does find love and belongingness, however, then his or her motivation shifts again, this time to esteem needs. Now, the concern is with gaining recognition and respect, and even more important, gaining self-respect. A student at this level may be unusually concerned with achievement, for example, though only if the achievement is visible or public enough to earn public recognition. So, being needs are desired to become fulfilled as a person, or to be the best person that you can possibly be. They include cognitive needs, which is a desire for knowledge and understanding; aesthetic needs, which is an appreciation of beauty and order; and most importantly, self-actualization needs, which is a desire for fulfillment of one's potential. Being needs emerge only after all of the person's deficit needs have been largely met. Unlike deficit needs, being needs beget more being needs. They do not disappear once they are met, but create a desire for even more satisfaction of the same type. A thirst for knowledge, for example, leads to further thirst for knowledge, and aesthetic appreciation leads to more aesthetic appreciation, partly because being needs are lasting and permanent once they appear. Maslow sometimes treated them as less hierarchical than deficit needs, and instead grouped cognitive, aesthetic, and self-actualization needs into a single category: self-actualization needs. People who are motivated by self-actualization have a variety of positive qualities, which Maslow went to some length to identify and describe. Self-actualizing individuals, he argued, value deep personal relationships with others, but also value solitude. They have a sense of humor, but do not use it against others. They accept themselves as well as others. They are spontaneous, humble, creative, and ethical. In short, the self-actualizing person has just about every good qualities imaginable. Not surprisingly, therefore, Maslow felt that the true self-actualization is rare. It is especially unusual among young people who have not yet lived long enough to satisfy earlier deficit-based needs. In a way, this last point is discouraging news for teachers who apparently must spend their lives providing as best they can for individuals, students still immersed in deficit needs. Teachers, it seems, have little hope of ever meeting a student who with fully fledged being needs. Taken less literally, though, Maslow's hierarchy is still useful for thinking about students' motives. Most teachers would argue that students, young though they are, can display positive qualities similar to the ones described in Maslow's self-actualizing person. However annoying students may sometimes be, there are also moments when they show care and respect for others, for example, and moments when they show spontaneity, humility, or a sound ethical sense. Self-actualization is an appropriate way to think about these moments, the times when students are at their best. At the same time, of course, students sometimes also have deficit needs. Keeping in mind the entire hierarchy outlined by Maslow can therefore deepen teachers' understanding of the full humanity of students. So after we have talked about social development, let's now move on to moral development. Morality is a system of beliefs about what is right and good compared to what is wrong and bad. Moral development, therefore, refers to changes in moral beliefs as a person grows older and gains maturity. Moral beliefs are related to but not identical with moral behavior. It is possible to know the right thing to do but not actually do it. It's also not the same as knowledge of social conventions, which are arbitrary customs needed for the smooth operation of society. Social conventions may have a moral element, but they have a primarily practical purpose. Conventionally, for example, motor vehicles all keep to the same side of the street, to the right in United States and in the Philippines, and to the left in Great Britain and other parts of the world. Now, the convention allows for smooth, accident-free flow of traffic, but following the convention also has a moral element. Because an individual who chooses to drive on the wrong side of the street can cause injuries or even death. In this sense, choosing the wrong side of the street is wrong morally, though the choice is also unconventional. When it comes to schooling and teaching, moral choices are not restricted to occasional dramatic incidents, but are woven into almost every aspect of classroom life. Imagine this simple example. Suppose that you are teaching, reading into a small group of second graders online, and the students are taking turn reading the story out loud. Should you give every student the same amount of time to read, even though some might benefit from having additional time? Or should you give more time to the student who needs extra help, even if doing so bores classmates and deprives others of equal shares of floor time? Which option for you is more fair? And which is more considerate? Simple dilemmas like this happen every day and at all grade levels, simply because students are diverse and because class time and the teacher's energies are finite. Embedded in this rather ordinary example, moral themes about fairness or justice on the other hand, and about consideration or care on the other. So, it is important to keep both themes in mind when thinking about how students develop beliefs about right or wrong. A morality of justice is about human rights, or more specifically, about respect for fairness, impartiality, equality, and individuals' independence. A morality of care, on the other hand, is about human responsibilities, more specifically, about caring for others, showing consideration for individuals' needs, and interdependence among individuals. Students and teachers need both forms of morality. So, in this part of the video, we will explain a major example of each type of developmental theory, beginning with the morality of justice. Now, one of the best known explanations of how morality of justice was developed by Lawrence Kohlberg, using a stage model similar to that of Piaget. Kohlberg proposed 6 stages of moral development, grouped into 3 levels. Individuals experience the stage universally and in sequence as they form beliefs about justice. He named the level simply pre-conventional, conventional, and you guessed it, post-conventional. Now, the pre-conventional level of morality, of moral development rather, coincides approximately with the preschool period of life and with Piaget's pre-operational period of thinking. At this stage, the child is still relatively self-centered and is insensitive to the moral effects of actions on others. The result is something short-sighted orientation to morality. Initially, Kohlberg's stage 1, the child adopts an ethics of obedience and punishment, a sort of a morality of keeping out of trouble. The rightness and wrongness of actions is determined by whether actions are rewarded or punished by authorities, such as parents or teachers. If helping yourself to a cookie brings affectionate smiles from adults, then taking the cookie is considered morally good. If it brings scolding instead, then it is morally bad. The child does not think about why an action might be praised or scolded. In fact, says Kohlberg, he would be incapable at stage 1 of considering the reasons even if adults offered them. Eventually, the child learns not only to respond to positive consequences, but also learns how to produce them by exchanging favors with others. The new ability creates stage 2, an ethics of market exchange. At this stage, the morally good action is one that favors not only the child but another person directly involved. A bad action is one that lacks this reciprocity. If trading the sandwich from your lunch for the cookie in your friend's lunch is mutually agreeable, then the trade is morally good. Otherwise, it's not. This perspective introduces a type of fairness into the child's thinking for the first time, but it still ignores the larger context of actions, the effect on people not present or directly involved. In stage 2, for example, it would also be considered morally good to pay a classmate to do another student's homework, or even to avoid bullying or to provide sexual favors, provided that both parties regard the arrangement as being fair. Conventional justice, or stage 2, is involved with conformity to peers and society. A child, or rather as children move into the school years, their lives expand into a larger number and range of peers, and eventually of the community as a whole. The change leads to conventional morality, which are beliefs based on what this larger area of people agree on. Hence, Kohlberg use of the term conventional. At first, in stage 3, the child's reference group are immediate peers. So stage 3 is sometimes called the ethics of peer opinion. If peers believe, for example, that it is morally good to behave politely with as many people as possible, then the child is likely to agree with the group and to regard politeness as not merely an arbitrary social convention, but a morally good one. So this approach to moral belief is a bit more stable than the approach in stage 2, because the child is taking into account the reactions not just of one other person, but of many. But it can still lead astray if the group settles on beliefs that adult considers morally wrong, like shoplifting for candy bars is fun and desirable. Eventually, as the child becomes a youth and the social world expands even more, he or she acquires even larger number of peers and friends. He or she is therefore more likely to encounter disagreements about ethical issues and beliefs. Resolving the complexity leads to stage 4, the ethics of law and order, in which the young person increasingly frames moral beliefs in terms of what the majority of society believes. Now, an action is morally good if it is legal or at least customarily approved by most people, including people whom the youth does not know personally. This attitude leads to an even more stable set of principles than in the previous stage, though it's still not immune from ethical mistakes. A community or society may agree, for example, that people of certain race should be treated with deliberate disrespect, or that a factory owner is entitled to dump wastewater into a commonly shared lake or river. To develop ethical principles that reliably avoid mistakes like these require further stages of moral development. Here comes the post-conventional thinking or post-conventional justice, which is involved with social contracts and universal principles. As a person becomes able to think abstractly or formally in Piaget's sense, ethical beliefs shift from acceptance of what the community does believe to be the process by which community beliefs are formed. So the new focus constitutes stage number 5, the ethics of social contract. Now an action, belief, or practice is morally good if it has been created through fair democratic processes that respect the rights of the people affected. Consider, for example, the laws in some areas that require motorcyclists to wear helmets. In what sense are the laws about this behavior ethical? what is created by consulting, or rather, was it created by consulting with and gaining the consent of the relevant people? Were cyclists consulted and did they give consent? Or how about doctors or the cyclists' families? Reasonable, thoughtful individuals disagree about how thoroughly and fairly these consultation processes should be. In focusing on the process by which the law was created, however, individuals are thinking according to stage 5, the ethics of social contract, regardless of the position they take about wearing helmets. In this sense, belief on both sides of a debate about an issue can sometimes be morally sound, even if they contradict each other. Paying attention to due process certainly seem like it should help to avoid mindless conformity. To conventional moral beliefs. As an ethical strategy, though, it too can sometimes fail. The problem is that an ethics of social contract places more faith in democratic process than the process sometimes deserves, and does not pay enough attention to the content of what gets decided. In principle and occasionally in practice, a society could decide democratically to kill off every member of a racial minority, for example, but would deciding this by due process make it ethical? The realization that ethical means can sometimes serve unethical ends leads some individuals towards stage 6. The ethics of self-chosen universal principles. At this final stage, the morally good action is based on personally held principles that apply both to the person's immediate life as well as to the larger community and society. The universal principles may include a belief in democratic due process, which is stage 5 ethics, but also other principles such as a belief in the dignity of all human life or the sacredness of the natural environment. At stage 6, the universal principle will guide a person's belief even if the principle means disagreeing occasionally with what is customary, that is stage 4, or even what is legal, that is stage 5. As logical as they sound, Kohlberg's stages of moral justice are not sufficient for understanding the development of moral beliefs. To see why, suppose that you have a student who asked for an extension of the deadline for an assignment. The justice orientation of Kohlberg's theory would prompt you to consider issues of whether granting the request is fair. Would the late student be able to put more effort in the assignment than other students? Would the extension place a difficult demand on you since you would have less time to mark the assignments? These are important considerations related to the rights of students and teachers. In addition to this, however, are considerations having to do with the responsibilities that you and the requesting students have for each other and for others. Does the student have a valid personal reason like illness, death in the family, a schedule for vaccination, or whatever, for the assignment being late? Will the assignment lose its educational value if the student has to turn it in prematurely? These latter questions have less to do with fairness and rights and more to do with taking care of and responsibility for students. They require a framework different from Kohlberg to be understood fully. And this is where Gilligan comes in. One such framework has been developed by Gilligan, whose ideas center on a morality of care, or system of belief about human responsibilities, care, and consideration for others. Gilligan proposed three moral positions that represents different extents of or breadth of ethical care. Unlike Kohlberg, Piaget, or Erikson, she does not claim that the positions form a strictly developmental sequence, but only that they can be ranked hierarchically according to their depth or subtlety. In this respect, her theory is semi-developmental in a way similar to Maslow's theory of motivation. So, the first position is caring as survival. The most basic kind of caring is survival orientation, in which a person is concerned primarily with his or her own welfare. If a teenage girl with this ethical position is wondering whether to get an abortion, for example, she will be concerned entirely with the effects of the abortion on herself. The morally good choice will be whatever creates the least stress for herself and that disrupts her own life the least. Responsibilities to others, the baby, the father, or her family play little or no part in her thinking. As a moral position, a survival orientation is obviously not satisfactory for a classroom on a widespread scale. If every student only looked out for himself or herself, classroom life might become rather unpleasant. Nonetheless, there are situations in which focusing primarily on yourself is both a sign of good mental health and relevant to teachers. For a child who has been bullied at school or sexually abused at home, for example, it's both healthy and morally desirable to speak out about how bullying or abuse has affected the victim. Doing so means essentially looking out for the victim's own needs at the expense of other people's needs, including the bully or the abuser. Speaking out in this case requires a survival orientation and is healthy because the child is taking care of herself. Now, the second position is conventional caring. So position number 2 is conventional caring. A more subtle moral position is caring for others, in which a person is concerned about others' happiness and welfare, and about reconciling or integrating others' needs where they conflict with each other. In considering an abortion, for example, the teenager at this position would think primarily about what other people prefer. Do the father, her parents, and or her doctor want her to keep the child? The morally good choice becomes whatever will please others the best. This position is more demanding than position 1, ethically and intellectually, because it requires coordinating several persons' needs and values, but it is often morally insufficient because it ignores one crucial person, the self. In classroom, students who operate from position 2 can be very desirable in some way. They can be eager to please, considerate, and good at fitting in and at working cooperatively with others. Because these qualities are usually welcome in a busy classroom, teachers can be tempted to reward students for developing and using them. The problem with rewarding position 2 ethics, however, is that doing so neglects the student's development, his or her academic and personal goals or values. Sooner or later, personal goals, values, and identity need attention and care, and educators have a responsibility for assisting students to discover and clarify them. The last position, position number 3, is integrated caring. The most developed form of moral caring in Gilligan's model is integrated caring, the coordination of personal needs and values with those of others. Now, the morally good choice takes account of everyone, including yourself, not only not everyone except yourself. In consideration, in considering an abortion, a woman at position 3 would think not only about the consequences for the father, the unborn child, and her family, but also about the consequences for herself. How would bearing a child affect her own needs, values, and plans? This perspective leads to moral belief that are more comprehensive, but ironically are also more prone to dilemmas because the widest possible range of individuals are being considered. In classrooms, integrated caring is most likely to surface whenever teachers give students wide, sustained freedoms to make choices. If students have little flexibility about their actions, there is little room for considering anyone else's needs or values, whether their own or others. If the teacher says simply, do the homework on page 50 and turn it in tomorrow morning, then the main issue becomes compliance, not moral choice. But suppose instead then that she said something like, over the next 2 months, figure out an inquiry project about the use of water resources in our town. Organize it in any way you want. Talk to people, read widely about it, and share it with the class in a way that all of us, including yourself, will find meaning. Now, an assignment like this poses moral challenges that are not only educational but also moral, since it requires students to make value judgments. Why? For one thing, students must decide what aspects of the topic really matters to them. Such a decision is partly a matter of personal values. For another thing, students have to consider how to make the topic meaningful or important to others in the class. Third, because the timeline for completion is relatively far in the future, students may have to weigh personal priorities, like spending time with the family or friends, against educational priorities, working on the assignment a bit more on the weekend. As you might suspect, some students might have trouble making good choices when given this sort of freedom, and their teachers might therefore be cautious about giving such an assignment. But the difficulties in making choices are part of Gilligan's point. Integrated caring is indeed more demanding than the caring based only on survival or on consideration of others. Not all students may be ready for it. So, in this lesson, in keeping with the general nature of developmental theory, we have often spoken of students in a generalized way. We refer to the child, student, or youngster, or as if a single typical or average individual exists and develop through single predictable pathway. However, as every teacher knows, development is not that simple. A class of 25 or 30 students will contain 25 or 30 individuals, each learning and developing along distinctive pathways. Why then student developmental patterns at all? Why should we study developmental patterns at all? Because underlying their obvious diversities, students indeed show important similarities. This lesson has indicated some of their similarities and how they relate to the job of teaching. The reference to the student should not be understood, therefore, as supporting simple-minded stereotypes. They refer instead to common tendencies of real, live children and youth, pointing to developmental changes is like pointing to a flock of birds in flight. The flock has a general location, but individual birds also have their own locations and take individual flight patterns. Development and diversity, therefore, have to be understood jointly, not separately. There are indeed similarities woven among the differences in students, but also differences woven among students' commonalities. I personally recommend, therefore, that you take this lesson on development together with the next one, which looks explicitly at student diversity. So, in conclusion, understanding development or the long-term changes in growth, behavior, and knowledge helps teachers to hold appropriate expectations for students as well as to keep students' individual diversity in perspective. From kindergarten through the end of high school, students double their height, triple their weight, experience the social and hormonal effects of puberty, and improve basic motor skills. Their health is generally good, though illness are affected significantly by students' economic and social circumstances. Cognitively speaking, students develop major new abilities to think logically and abstractly based on a foundation of sensory and motor experiences with the objects and people around them. Jean Piaget was one well-known theorist detailing how these changes unfold. Socially, students face and resolve a number of issues, especially the issue of industry, which is dedicated and sustained work during childhood, and the issue of identity during adolescence. Erikson has described these crises in details, as well as social crises that precede and follows the school years. Students are motivated by both basic human needs, food, safety, belonging, esteem, and by needs to enhance themselves psychologically, which involves self-actualization. Abraham Maslow has described these motivations and how they relate to each other. Lastly, morally, students develop both a sense of justice and of care for others, and their thinking in each of these realms undergoes important changes as they mature. Lawrence Kohlberg has described changes in children and youth's belief about justice, and Carol Gilligan has described changes in their beliefs about care. This ends our lesson in student development. My name is Dex Kamitan, and thank you for watching.